What lies ahead for America under Joe Biden and the Democrats? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's segment of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the principled and compromising case for the libertarian philosophy and what we need to do to get this country back on the right track. And I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel, who knows exactly what we need to do to get this country back on the right track. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you too, and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, thanks for your tuning in. Okay, Richard, so we have a new president, a new administration. There's all this, hope and optimism and, talk of unification. And if we can all just get together, boy, the whole welfare warfare state will finally be made to work. They're going to lead us to the promised land. And boy, how often have we seen this? I mean, they take the position, these Democrats and their supporters in the mainstream press, that the only reason that this country's plunged in chaos and crises is because Donald Trump was there for 4 years. And if only Hillary had been elected instead, everything would be hunky-dory. Well, that's just ridiculous. I mean, as we've said for 30 years, this is not a question of, one person being a better president than another person. This is a systemic problem. You've got a welfare warfare state way of life that is a dysfunctional system. It's contrary to the founding principles of this country, the founding principles of economics, of economic liberty, of limited government, of a private property order. And they sell it all as a continuation, but we libertarians know it was an abandonment. The welfare state, first of all, with Roosevelt in the 30s, and the warfare state in the 50s. And today we live under this gigantic monstrosity known as a national security state or a military industrial complex or a welfare warfare state. That's the problem. And that's what these people don't realize. They just don't get it. They think, oh, if we can just get Biden in, this will finally make the welfare warfare state work. Well, it won't. And a classic example of this is more your forte as an economist, and of course the author of our great FFF book, Monetary Central Planning in the State, is what's her name, Yellen, who Biden has appointed or is appointing to be head of the Treasury. She was head of the Federal Reserve, and she immediately comes out with this statement. It's phenomenal, that what we need is more government spending. Wow, if only somebody had thought of that before now. I mean, Donald Trump himself was a big spender. Every president in our lifetimes has been a big spender. But here, of all times, when the debt's, where is it, 28, 29 trillion, that they're talking about another $1.9 trillion stimulus package. I mean, what happened to the other stimulus package? It doesn't seem to have stimulated very much. And she says, well, debt doesn't matter. We'll just keep piling on more debt and more debt to the federal government. I mean, doesn't she realize that when you're borrowing this amount of money, you're sucking all of this money out of the economy in order to send checks to people? I mean, how can that not have an effect on the economic well-being of the country? And that, of course, combined with the lockdowns and the shutdowns and then the massive debt. I mean, I think that you're probably looking at a national debt, a federal debt at the end of this 4 years is probably close to $35 trillion. And this cannot end well, Richard. We know this as Austrian economists, as libertarians, that this notion of just unrestrained government spending as being the solution to prosperity and wealth in a society is just a fool's errand. It's a pipe dream. If that were the case, every nation on earth would be wealthy, including Venezuela and North Korea. This is a road to disaster. And Biden's already reflecting that with respect to what he's doing with Yellen and what she's doing with respect to out of control spending and debt. What do you think?
Well, I think that you're not being fair.
Oh,
I mean, what matters are good intentions. They want to do good for America. And merely because they haven't gotten it right up till now doesn't mean that with a little bit more effort and money and even better intentions, they won't get it right next time. I mean, you're talking about things as absurd and as irrelevant as reality, scarcity, limits. I mean, are you insisting upon being constrained by reality? I think that your perspective is totally wrong, Jacob. You have to accept La La Land. And once you accept La La Land, everything makes sense and the future can be beautiful. Now, I know I'm being excessively sarcastic, but the fact is that at one level, it seems to me that whether it be Biden now and Janet Yellen clearly going to be approved to be the Secretary of the Treasury, uh, and what the Republicans and Democrats are doing before this election in terms of just the huge additional spending by the federal government during the beginning of the pandemic, and now Biden's proposal of another, $1.9 trillion, practically $2 trillion, is that they have a fantasy land that printing money represents real wealth. You know, this is even in a sense inconsistent with Keynesian economics. In the Keynesian view, okay, just stating what they presume, the idea is that something has failed in the market. People won't spend enough. People won't produce enough. They want to, but somehow something has clogged the arteries of the system. And if the government can just, get the system going by running deficits and giving people an incentive with spending money, things will be all better. This is a situation that we have had this massive implosion of the economy, not because of some Keynesian presumed market failure, but because of the very things the government did. You mentioned them. Beginning last March, and for several months, there was a severe, if not complete, virtual lockdown. Partly the federal government, mostly the state governments. Okay, they don't go to work. Stop producing except essential goods. Don't go out of your house. Only shop for pharmaceutical products or food. Stay this distance. Wear a mask. Don't go near anybody. Well, if you command the society to stop working, stop producing, stop buying, and stop consuming, why should you be surprised that the economy has imploded? All that you need to do is to allow the market to be reopened and free and get the government out of the way. All these extra trillions of dollars to do is going to be making these things worse. We're sucking resources out of the private sector and then misdirecting them in ways that will lead to a recession further down the road that is going to be inevitable and inescapable.
Yeah, well, you've got this sense that if only we can just get a better central planner in all these areas, that the solution is there. If you take the healthcare crisis, for example, you've got this pandemic, which we libertarians always said this is a natural disaster. Okay, it's a disaster. There's no question about it. But bad things happen in life. I mean, if you live long enough, that's a truism. And so the question is, what do you do about it? Well, libertarians say, just keep the government out of it. If there had been a separation of healthcare in the state, like we've been saying for 30 years here at FFF, this would have been a private sector matter. The healthcare industry would have risen to the occasion, given advice to people. This is what we suggest. This is what we recommend. The economy would have kept going, and people would have dealt with the crisis. Would people have died? Of course. They die of the flu every year. They die of all sorts of things. Death is sort of part of life. But it would have been a much better outcome than this chaos that we have today. The problem with the Democrats and the mainstream press is they think that it's all Trump's fault, that Trump was just a bad manager, which of course he was, but anybody that manages a system based on central planning is going to be a bad manager. And this notion that, oh, no, Biden's going to resolve the pandemic. Oh, everything's going to be hunky-dory is just ridiculous. Again, because it's the system that's the problem, the central planning system. And that's what we need to keep challenging people with as libertarians. And this is where I take some of our fellow libertarians to task. They won't do that. They have settled for the state involvement in healthcare. They want to keep the Centers for Disease Control intact. They want to keep the FDA in track. They just want to reform it. They want health savings accounts to solve the problem. Well, that's ridiculous. We have to keep in mind there was a healthcare crisis, a severe crisis, before the pandemic. I mean, that was why Obamacare was enacted, because there was a crisis. And so there's a severe crisis independent of the pandemic. The pandemic has only made it worse. So what is Biden going to do? Oh, he's going to throw $1.9 trillion at it. Who knows? But it's still going to be a disaster. This is what these people don't get. And notice what he's doing already on immigration. I mean, this is really funny, he's going to really resolve the immigration crisis. Really? Did he do so when he was part of the Obama administration for 8 years? Obama was known as the deporter in chief. So it's not that Trump and Biden are different in this area. Okay, so he issues an executive order to stop construction on Trump's Berlin Wall. Whoop-de-doo. You've still got this whole system of central planning intact, which is the crux of a socialist system, central planning, that's going to produce death, chaos, crises, an ongoing immigration crisis, just like we had through the 8 years of the Obama-Biden administration. Nothing's going to change in terms of fundamentals. The only thing that can change is if you change the system. It's like a paradigm shift. Once your paradigm has proven to be inherently defective, and that's what their system is, their welfare state is inherently defective. Forget about reform. Forget about getting a better manager like Biden, or if something happens to him, Kamala Harris. They cannot make a bad system work. And I think it is once that settles into Americans, into the minds of enough Americans, it says, gosh, Jacob, you're saying that regardless of who we elect, they can't make this system work? Yep, that's exactly what I'm saying. Oh, wow. Well, then where does that leave us? Well, that leaves us only one way out of this morass: libertarianism. Dismantle this immoral, defective system and let freedom reign.
Well, the core to this is how they view those who man government. I'm holding here in my phone, my hand, my phone, and like many, I read a lot of the news. And there is a columnist for the New York Times named Ezra Klein, very prominent left of center columnist for the New York Times. So in today's column that he has, he's talking about what Biden needs to do, what the future holds in store. The best hope Biden has of bringing the country together lies in policy, not rhetoric, right? Referring to what the nice words that Biden had in his inaugural address. As I write my column this morning, he needs to make people's lives better and fast. Notice, he needs to make people's lives better and fast. In other words, we elect someone who is to command, direct, plan, dictate, determine people's betterment. In other words, unless we have a political paternalist guiding, deciding, allocating, determining, using, commanding, telling, we're all helpless little nabobs who can't do anything for ourselves. This is the worst mentality imaginable. Now, I'm not criticizing Mr. Ezra Klein as a person. I will presume that he is an honest and sincere individual who is concerned with how do we make people's lives better, just as you and I. We're human beings. We want our fellow human beings' lives to be better. But it is the mindset, it's the mentality that we make people's lives better by putting the right person in charge. And with that power, latitude, and discretion, he can implement the policies to lift us up. And if we do not have the right person implementing the right policies to lift us up, we remain down. The idea that individuals free to make their own decisions, their own goals, select their own purposes, decide on the best means to try to achieve their ends, to freely and mutually and voluntarily interact with their fellow human beings inside and outside of the marketplace for mutual betterment and enhancement of their lives, never crosses their mind. We are dependent, infantile children who will just crawl along in a room, not knowing how to get out of the room without someone opening the door and then taking our hand and leading us to utopia. As long as that remains the mindset, which is complementary to what you were saying, we are at a dead end and worse circumstances to look forward to in the future.
I couldn't agree with you more. And it goes back to, I think, the Franklin Roosevelt administration. I mean, there were seeds of it beforehand. The income tax, a national federal income tax, had been adopted in 1913, along with the Federal Reserve System. But the real watershed period came with the Franklin Roosevelt administration. I mean, here you had the stock market crash as a direct result of the Federal Reserve policies in the 1920s. And then you had his New Deal that really transformed American life. But people looked at him and he presented himself as the great daddy, the great God that, boy, I will take care of you. That's when Social Security got adopted. The American people never adopted Social Security either in the Constitution or for the first 125 years of American history. This was a socialist program that the Roosevelt administration put into play. And the idea was that, oh, you can't be managing your own retirement. You can't be managing your own healthcare decisions, your charitable decisions. We need to force you to do this. We need to make the nation caring and compassionate through law and edicts and the Internal Revenue Service and audits and investigations. And then now we're a very benevolent, compassionate country, as we can see with Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and welfare and farm subsidies and foreign aid. And of course, meanwhile, the whole country is going to pot because you've got all this coercion and all this out of control spending and debt. I mean, I think that we may be reaching it here in the early part of this century, the ultimate outcome of this way of life. I mean, all you need is another foreign war, and I think there's a good chance Biden will start one, ramp up old ones like Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. I think he'll do whatever the national security establishment wants him to do. But if you've got a foreign policy crisis that takes a lot of money, along with this pandemic crisis and the lockdown crisis and the out of control spending and debt crisis, and the debasement of the dollar. I mean, let's not forget that. I mean, they're printing money like there was no tomorrow to fund all this. I think you may see the ultimate crack up. You know, I remember back in the 70s when you and I were advancing libertarianism back then, or at least had discovered it, and they were talking about the crack up boom and things like this. And the doomsdayers were saying, hey, we're looking for some really bad times. I think those predictions might finally be a good chance coming true here in the next 4 years. This is a system that is rotten to the core, and it cannot end well.
Well, I think that is that you have to take the long view here. It is very easy, whether you like Biden, Trump or not, to get very despondent and despairing about the policies likely, and in fact, already beginning to be implemented by Biden through executive orders. We have to focus on realizing that if we want policy to change, the climate of ideas has to change. And the climate of ideas have to change enough among our fellow citizens that they will, as you were suggesting, ask, can government even do these things that they say they are wanting to do for our benefit? And when people realize that they cannot bring about the good results that are promised, and in fact, it's the very premise of relying upon government that is the problem and not the solution, is the beginning of the turnover. But if I can just go back to what I said a second ago, the mindset is also demonstrated in this idea of executive orders. The idea that the man who sits at the Oval Office in the White House has such a discretionary authority to do what? To order the building of a wall on the Mexican border, or to stop a wall, to say that the Keystone Pipeline can be built, to say that the Keystone Pipeline will not be built, to say that we're changing immigration policy. We're not changing immigration policy. We're leaving the Paris Accords on climate change, or we're coming back to the Paris Accords on climate change. Or the idea that there is a king who rules by fiat, and in this case, an elected king who is not bound through the normal congressional process of legislation when it involves funds beginning in the House, passing to the Senate evaluates it, the two houses decide, have a reconciliation, and a piece of legislation then goes to the president to be signed, or any other similar types of legislation where foreign policy matters begin in the Senate. Now, notice what I'm saying here, Jacob. I'm not talking about the content of a particular piece of legislation being, quote, good or bad. I'm talking about the procedure of restricted and limited and divided government. So as to require procedural thinking about what you're doing and how you're doing and why you're doing. You know, if you read Madison's notes from the Constitutional Convention, the issue came out about who should be able to start war. And some wanted to, well, the president should be able to declare war. But others said, no, we don't want to leave this up to the hands of one man. We want to not make it easier. We want to clog the process. There has to be a proposal for a declaration of war. Both houses of Congress have to vote on the declaration of war. It has to be approved, signed and approved by a president. In other words, let's stop and think deliberatively and hear many different points of views before one person decides this by a fiat decision. You see what I'm saying here? Now, what do we have now? We don't even have the congressional processes here of deliberation and thinking twice and hearing different viewpoints and people debating whether this would be good or bad, just procedurally. We now have this wide area of executive authority that, as Obama said, oh, the Republicans controlling Congress won't give me what I want. Well, I have a pen and a phone, which means I will just by fiat say that the executive has these latitudes of responsibility, and I will just make law. I will impose regulations. I will reverse this. I will not reverse that. I'll implement something else. This is highly dangerous, but is itself an indication of that kind of a mindset that Klein is going to. The Biden has to do something now to make people's lives better. Just give the king authority, and all will be happy and good.
Yeah, I think that's what goes into a lot of talk of unifying and unifying the country, and let's all rally around and support whatever the king says, and no dissent. And if there is dissent, it's dissenters that are causing the problems. And listening to you talk, I'm reminded of General Pinochet, who, of course, the U.S. national security establishment helped install into power after destroying Chile's democratic system there. And I find that regime very fascinating because the way Pinochet ruled was exactly the way you described. I mean, this guy was a total dictator, military dictator, but dictator nonetheless. And so there was no Congress that he had to go to get things done. He just would sign the decree, the executive order. And you know what they were called? They were called decree laws, because whatever the decree was the law. And you know, there's people that just don't see anything wrong with that. You know, let's elect the right person and then give him the authority to do whatever is necessary. And what you're talking about is process. You know, we're not talking about whether a policy is good or not. We're talking about what should be the process in a democratic system. And as you point out, in the war-making area, the process is Congress determines whether we're going to go to war, not the president. But yet, who complies with that, Richard? I mean, no president complies with that. The Congress doesn't care that the president now makes that determination. The Supreme Court abandoned or abrogated its responsibility in this area, decades ago. But we saw it with Trump. You know, when Trump started the trade war with China, he didn't go to Congress to get that authorization. He just unilaterally did it. And they took him to task. Some people took him to task for the trade war itself, saying this was bad policy, but not on the process. It was only libertarians that said, hey, Why should you make this determination yourself? Or when he started putting farmers into bankruptcy because of his trade war, he starts a welfare program for them. Did he go to Congress to do that? No. His Berlin Wall along the border, he tried to get Congress to authorize money for that, and they said no. So he goes to the Pentagon and says, hey, you guys got some slush money over here. Let me use that instead. Well, people objected to the wall, but they didn't object to the authoritarian dictatorial concept here. And all you're doing is saying Biden needs to be held to the same standard that we would hold Trump to, that this is not the correct process. You want to do something, you go to Congress and ask for permission.
And in fact, if you want to appreciate where this presidential mindset can be said to have begun, during World War II, Franklin Roosevelt had two meetings, wartime meetings with Joseph Stalin. And when he came back from his meetings, he was talking to one of his aides, or maybe it was personal physician, I forget who the individual was. But he says, I like dealing with Stalin. He's the whole works. He doesn't have to deal with the Congress. You make a deal with him, and that's it. See this mentality? Why can't I, as president, do the same thing? And in fact, when Roosevelt came back from the Yalta Conference after February of 1945, and is giving a report before the joint houses of Congress, read his words. I and Stalin and Churchill have decided. We determined. I didn't get everything I wanted, but he didn't get everything. I didn't get. I decided. I will make happen. I will be implementing. What? No Yalta Conference agreement ever went before Congress. Germany is going to be divided up in this way into occupation zones. These countries are going to be signed to Stalin's tender care. We're going to cut a deal that to get Stalin to enter the war in the Pacific, he gets these territories from the Japanese and from part of China. End of story. I decided. He's the whole works. Why can't I be that way?
Yeah, and after Roosevelt let Stalin have all of Eastern Europe and East Germany, then Truman gets all upset and says, well, the Soviets are warmongers. They won't get out of the countries that Roosevelt gave to him. But actually, Roosevelt's mindset went even further back than that in the 30s. Recall that when he felt he knew how to get out of this Great Depression and that nothing should be interfering with him or get in his way. So at least he went to Congress on some things like the National Industrial Recovery Act, but on the nationalization of gold, he just decreed gold nationalized. Everybody was ordered to turn in his gold. But when the Supreme Court stepped in and at least declared some of his stuff unconstitutional, like the National Industrial Recovery Act, Roosevelt was furious. Oh, they're interfering. These 9 old men are interfering with my ability to save the nation. And that's when he came up with this repugnant court packing scheme that it was even being talked about as part of the Trump administration by the Democrats. They were going to plan to do it again, where Roosevelt said, I'll just pack the court with additional justices to match up with every justice over 70. And then I'll outnumber them, and I'll be able to get everything I want. I mean, this is the classic mindset of dictators that just get out of my way, agree with what I do. I know what's best, and if we just unify behind me, everything will be fine.
Yeah, the other element of this is not only the presumption, the hubris, the arrogance of those in political power who believe that they should or have such authority to act in these unilateral ways. And that's what it is. No rule of law, no due process, no procedures, right? Just fiat. The related aspect of that is that how so many Americans have been conditioned now after administration after administration, generation after generation, to presume, well, okay, that's what government is supposed to do. That's what the president is there for. The default of giving presidents the authority to do this by those who, in fact, the ultimate voters who could say no.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's just going to get worse. I mean, this mindset, because the mainstream press thinks all this is great, this is fantastic, but I think things are just going to get worse and worse. And ultimately, it's up to the American people to decide: is this the kind of system you want? Because there is a way out, and this is what I've been emphasizing for years now: that everybody should not be unaware of the fact that there is a way out of this morass. It's not by electing Joe Biden. It's not by giving the Democrats control of Congress or the Republicans or whatever. This entails a brand new system. It's not really brand new. It's built on the founding principles of America, but a system based on genuine free markets, free enterprise, private property, and a limited government republic. We shouldn't forget, Richard, in the waning moments here, that we've got, another problem, the problem of assassination that now the federal government wields, indefinite detention, torture, Guantanamo Bay. These are all things that Joe Biden has lived with and supported and been part of. I think you're going to see, well, I know you're going to see a continuation of these policies. You're certainly not going to see an end to them, and you could see an aggravation of them. But imagine a government having omnipotent power to assassinate whoever it thinks is a terrorist or a threat to national security, and even worse, fully supported by or upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court. This is not a free society. This is not what you and I envision to be a free society. But the way out of it is there: libertarianism. All right. On that note, Richard, we'll wrap things up. We're out of time. Thank you all for tuning in, and we look forward to, by the way, you can subscribe to our FFF Daily. Our subscriptions are soaring in that area. Also to our monthly journal, Future of Freedom. We've got a great conference planned coming up in the spring. We'll give you more details on that in the next month. And it's going to be virtual, online. And we look forward to talking to y'all next week. Richard, I look forward to exchanging views with you as this Biden administration starts to unfold.
Thank you, and thanks to our viewers and listeners for joining us.